Hello, everyone. I'm so glad you're able to join me again in this, your podcast, Optica, Reflective Faith and Latinidad, where we're asking you to open your eyes and see what God is doing. I want to thank all of you who've been listening faithfully week after week, sending us questions, comments, suggestions. They are most welcome. And, of course, we invite you to share this podcast with your friends, with people who might be interested in learning about a reflective faith and its impact in Hispanicity and Latinidad. And for the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about justice work and advocacy. Today, I want to answer a question that arose from a comment from one of the members of my church, together with my wife, who, as you know, is the co-lead pastor of the church, The Gathering Place. And somebody asked her, because they know we've been doing this advocacy work and this pastoring for well over 2 decades, it says, what keeps you going? That is a great question. Perhaps said another way, instead of what keeps you going, the question might be, why haven't you quit? Have you ever asked yourself that? What keeps you from quitting? What keeps you on the treadmill of ministry and advocacy and pastoring or not-for-profit work, wherever God has called you, whether you're a teacher, whether you're an advocate, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a lawyer, whatever vocation God has called you to. Why are you still at it after so many years? So today on Optica, I want to wrestle with that question: quitting, resistance, and resilience. I think one of the major questions that I've been wrestling with is, hey, Gabe, how do you respond to resistance when you have naysayers and when you have people speak ill of you? How do you stand up and say, hey, I want to keep going? And perhaps the best way I'm able to answer that question is, what gives me joy? What gives you joy in the vocation and the calling God has called you to? I spoke with Jeanette the other day, and I said to her in the car, I said, one of the things that gives me joy is knowing that God has called me. I'm so honored that to have the privilege to know that I'm a co-laborer with God. Whatever your vocation is, whatever your sacred calling or your sacred task might be, I think one of the things that can keep us on task and keep joy in the midst of sometimes tedious work, because not everything we do is exciting. There's tedious work, there's paperwork, there's difficult people. Sometimes we're difficult ourselves, is knowing in our hearts that God called us. What a great privilege that is, that we are co-laborers with God in what God is doing in the world. So what gives me joy when I'm tempted to quit? Reminding myself that I have the privilege of being a co-worker with God. I think the second thing, and this might be obvious for so many people, but I think it's worth mentioning, is seeing lives and families changed. That actually the work we do makes a difference. Perhaps it's not the headline of a newspaper, and perhaps it's not giving millions of likes on one of our social media platforms. And quite frankly, anonymity can be quite helpful to keep our egos in check. But to know, either privately or publicly, that lives are being changed, that a marriage is being reconciled, that a wayward child is being reintegrated into his or her family, that a law is being changed in a way that benefits thousands, if not millions of people who may be vulnerable or living in the margins. This understanding, this reflection that God is calling us to work that makes impacts, great and small, and that lives somehow through our work, either directly or indirectly, are being changed. I think that gives me joy. I think the third thing that gives me joy is to know that I'm a part of a team, that I'm co-laboring with other men and women, young people of diverse generations, that I'm not in this alone. You might remember Paul's reflection when he said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gives the increase. that this is a team effort, that no one is doing whatever ministry or vocation or task God has called him or her to alone, that we're part of a greater mosaic of what God is doing in the world. And if we're honest, we're not always going to see the results, maybe not even in our lifetimes, but we're giving our very best to contribute to moving, so to speak, that ball down the field. And isn't it exciting that the writer of the book of Hebrews says we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses? And so the teacher, the principal, the lawyer, the stay-at-home parent, the nurse, the physician, the judge, the principal, whatever task, the pastor, when he or she is working in the day-to-day task, it can be tedious. And quite frankly, one of the great temptations is to give in to boredom, because not everything we do is exciting. Perhaps when you're writing the sermon, you're not always all pepped up, or when you're preparing the song you're writing, or when you're preparing that lesson for the next week, or when you're cleaning your house, or where you're changing your child's diapers. There's not a lot of hoopla around it, but you're actually doing something that transforms life. And we must resist the temptation of giving in to boredom. So let me just lay this to rest right away. There will be boredom, even in a sacred task, even in what God has called you to do. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, in his book, Life Together, reminds us that part of our job in our daily living, in our quotidian life, is to engage in the mundane, as even that is sacred in our day-to-day task. And so perhaps there's a young person listening, or a person who's been at this for years and says, you know why I want to quit? Because I'm bored. The same thing over and over. I'm the worship leader, and every Sunday I have to lead a congregation of worship. I'm the pastor, and every Sunday and every midweek I have to bring a fresh sermon. I'm a school teacher, and every week and every year I have to teach lessons about the conjugation of verbs. I'm a principal, and I have to set teachers' schedules. I'm a painter, and I have to take out that roller and up and down and up and down. But it's a sacred task. And once we embrace the reality that what God has called us to do, we do it to the glory of God. Scripture says it to this: whatsoever you do, in word or in deed, do it unto the glory of God. I'm reminded of the famous speech by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he says, hey, if it is your lot in life, and I'm paraphrasing, if it is your lot in life to be a street sweeper or street cleaner, clean the streets, sweep the streets like Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. If it is your lot in life to be a teacher or to be a stay-at-home parent, you do it with all of the excellence that you can muster. So why do some people quit? And if I'm honest, on my worst moments, because I'm not always at my best, boredom is a great temptation. So every time I'm tempted by boredom to quit, I say to myself, God called you to co-labor with him in this task. The second thing that is a temptation is resistance. I know you know it like I know it. Not every time you do something do you get an applause. Not everyone celebrates what you're doing, especially if it's something that requires people to change or to reconsider their position, as is the case of advocacy, when we call people to reimagine what is for what can be, what ethicists call the difference between isness and oughtness. And so when you're calling people to reconsider and reimagine how they live their lives, how they interact with their neighbors, there will be resistance. And quite frankly, the more intense the resistance, the greater the temptation to quit. And so if I'm honest, on my share of times, I've had the urge to hang up my boots, whether it's pastoring or an advocacy work, because the resistance has been so much that I get tired. And now listen, there's no sin in being tired. Jesus rested. God's self rested on the seventh day. God commands the land to rest. And so after resting in the midst of resistance, you're able to reboot. You're able to gather new strength like the eagle and then engage on the journey back again. So it's important to, as soon as you start your sacred vocation, to say, there will be moments of resistance with varying levels of intensity, but I'm going to stay at it because I'm co-laboring with God, and because lives are changed, and because I'm collaborating with a great team of men, women, and young people and older people of multi-generations to have a kingdom impact in the world. The last thing I want to say about quitting in the midst of resistance and how we acquire resilience is conviction. I was once on a panel in Washington, D.C., at the Forum of Theological Exploration, when we were talking about mentoring what they call, in the language of the forum in those days, emerging generations or emerging leaders. And I started talking about conviction, how conviction can serve as fuel to the work that we do, the work that we're called to do. And I remember getting pushback by somebody saying, well, conviction can be a bad thing because a lot of people have had conviction about wrong things. And I said, well, that's true. But it's conviction that took Martin Luther King Jr. to walk the streets and resist segregation in the southern parts of the United States. It's conviction that held Nelson Mandela in South Africa to resist the apartheid regimes. It's conviction that allowed the early church to resist the Roman Empire and the extreme persecution of that emerging faith called Christianity in the Roman Empire. And so conviction in perhaps a postmodern world where everything that strikes of conviction can often be interpreted as imposition needs to be reimagined. Dare I say it, re-embraced. The only reason, or perhaps one of the only reasons, better said, for me to keep doing what I'm doing, for you to keep doing what you're doing, is because you have conviction. What is conviction? Conviction is the firm belief, not this Pollyanna belief, not a belief that is easily swayed, the firm belief that you have a purpose to which God has called you. Conviction about a cause, about a calling, about a task. The firm belief that you were called by God to do what you're doing. Of course, many of us have had wrong convictions and we've had to reimagine it. But could you imagine a leader without conviction? Could you imagine a worship leader who doesn't have conviction about the songs he or she writes or sings? Could you imagine a preacher who doesn't have conviction about the gospel he or she proclaims? Could you imagine a church planter who doesn't have conviction that in his or her church planting, there's real kingdom impact in the neighborhood where God has called him or her? Could you imagine parenting without the conviction that God has called you to raise godly children? And so I'm here for it. I'm here for reclaiming conviction as gas, as fuel against quitting. I think that I often get emails, and I'm probably going to get some around this. Conviction should not be dependent on ephemeral, easily changing things. What do you mean? What does Optica mean when it asks conviction shouldn't be planted on things that are easily movable or easily changeable? Let me give you an example. Conviction should not be founded on your net worth. Money comes, money goes. Possessions come, possessions go. Conviction should not be based on some kind of modern construct of consumerism. A modern construct of, hey, I am what I own. I am what belongs to me. No. Conviction is deeper than some superficial understanding of net worth based on money or possessions. Materialism. No. Or power. I am my title. Titles come and go. We have different titles in different stages of our lives. Sometimes we're the pastor, and sometimes we're the member. Sometimes we're the CEO, and sometimes we're the stakeholder. Sometimes we're the teacher, and sometimes we're the student. So our conviction is not deeply grounded in our position in life, nor on the things we own, neither materialism nor position. Conviction is based on that we're called and we're deeply loved. And because we're called and we're deeply loved, we deeply love others and deeply work for their flourishing, for their stability, for their health, for their wholeness. And so, if we don't have conviction, I assure you, as you probably know from your own life experience, when that first wave of resistance comes, we may give up on something we're called and made to do, designed to do. If we don't have conviction, the first time we have a naysayer, we might say, the naysayer's right. I wasn't made for this. Let me try something else. If we don't have conviction, we may not have the capacity to imagine, to see, to envision a new world. So how about it? Would you reimagine resistance and resilience? Would you seek joy in your calling? Would you stand up against easy quitting in a world with many adversities? Hey, as always, I want to thank you for joining Optica, Reflective Faith and Latinidad. I want to keep inviting you to share with your friends and also subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, if this came into your inbox or a friend recommended it to you, subscribe on any of our social media pages at Pastor Salguero or on our Spotify of Optica, Reflective Faith and Latinidad. However it is that you're able to hear and be touched by this message, we invite you to join and invite others. Until the next time, I'm Gabe Salguero, and this has been Optica, Reflective Faith and Latinidad, inviting you to open your eyes and see what God is doing.